to the Mind and Matter podcast, where we talk about how what you consume, from food to drugs and ideas, influences who you become. I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and I have a background in academic science, independent research, and writing, and I'm the creator of the Mind and Matter podcast and Substack page. I got a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University, where I studied the neurobiology of feeding behavior, and before that, I studied evolutionary genetics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On normal episodes of the podcast, I talk mainly with scientists, academics, and other experts about topics that interest me as a biologist, ranging from neuroscience to metabolism, evolution, animal behavior, and the effects of drug, food, and biotechnology. This episode is part of a special sub-series where I talk to independent scholars who are often not affiliated with major institutions like universities, but who I believe have interesting perspectives. These conversations are often more multidisciplinary in nature, connecting my areas of scientific interest with subjects spanning social psychology, culture, religion, history, and the rise and fall of civilizations, areas which may sometimes be more taboo, controversial, or outside the Overton window of popular discourse. These episodes are available in full to paid subscribers on the Mind and Matter Substack page or my YouTube channel. Hey everyone, I want to share with you a new AI-powered research tool I've been using to find scientific papers and learn from the literature. It's called Consensus. It is an AI-powered search tool built using large language models trained to help you find and understand the best science faster. Consensus helps you not only find individual papers, but its AI models will help you assess research quality and even synthesize insights across multiple papers for you. You can ask it general questions about any topic you might have, such as what are the known risks and benefits of a certain prescription drug? What do we know about how a certain food or nutrient affects the human body? Anything you can think of. Its Pro Analysis feature will actually provide you with a concise, written summary of what the literature says, broken down point by point, highlighting the strength of the evidence across papers, and providing you with individual studies ranked by the relevance and including additional information like citation rates, journal quality, and more. You can also save, cite, and share individual studies with a single click. Unlike other AI and search tools like ChatGPT, PubMed, or Google Scholar, Consensus uses over 20 custom large language models that are developed and trained for this specific purpose. The base Consensus product is totally free, but the premium product that you can subscribe to has better features and unlimited queries. And I highly recommend this if you are using outdated tools like PubMed or Google Scholar, or you just do your own research. For a limited time, you can use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL, all one word, to get a free premium subscription for 1 year. That is a $150 value for free if you use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL today. So click the link in the episode description or check my support page and give Consensus a try. Use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL to unlock your free premium subscription today.
Background. I did a dissertation on predicting personality from how people act online. So I predicted big five personality, satisfaction with life, IQ, a bunch of psychometric traits from people's Facebook statuses. And then I also made a contribution by rederiving the big five from word vectors. And so that's my academic background. And then I've worked for 3 years after graduating in the medical space. So predicting, I worked at a startup that was using VR to predict concussion and Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. And so there's all sorts of VR games, and the way you move your eyes is actually extremely informative of if you're concussed, and also for dementia. So I was doing a lot of signal processing on highly multimodal data. Mm-hmm. There. So I'm a data scientist with an interest in language models as well as psychometrics.
Mm-hmm. So you've got a background in psychology, quantitative, psychometrics.
I have a background in electrical engineering is what my program was. Okay. But I did publish in JPSP, so that's like the flagship personality journal.
Yeah. Okay, so you're more of an engineer and data scientist who was applying the tools of the trade to some aspects of psychology. You weren't trained as a psychologist.
Yes. I mean, we don't have, like, from an engineer's point of view, anything you're trying to predict is the same. So it could be, does this person want to buy shoes or not? Or is this person extroverted or not? And then I got very interested in, like, what is this ground truth label of personality? Like, how did we come up with that? And what are the characteristics? And so that was how I got into psychometrics. And the name of my blog, Vectors of Mind, comes from a 20th century electrical engineer who did the same. So he founded the journal Psychometrica, and that's L.L. Thornstone. And so there's precedent for this, going from electrical engineering to psychometrics, tried and true.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the most interesting ideas in science, very broadly speaking, in my opinion, they come from someone who sort of who has one type of background that's not traditionally associated with another field, and the methods and ideas of one field get imported into another one where they sort of didn't live before, and there's a lot of fruitful cross-fertilization that comes from not having things all completely siloed. We don't need to get off on a tangent, but in many ways the entire field of molecular biology was founded by physicists who then got interested in biology, and it led to this sort of blossoming of this new subfield. But what we're going to talk about today is what you write about on your Substack, and that's what you call, I think, the Ape Theory of consciousness. And I'm just going to sort of, if you don't mind, I'm going to summarize what I think sort of the thesis is here, and then you can correct me if I get it wrong in its broad strokes, and we'll sort of wander back to what this is after we give people some background and cover some of the details that go into this. But in essence, my sort of read of the area of human evolution, paleoanthropology, just broadly speaking, how humans evolved, is, again, roughly speaking, you've got anatomically modern humans. They evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe 200 or so thousand years ago. And anatomically modern to a paleoanthropologist just means their bones look like our bones. If you dig up people from a couple 100,000 years ago, their skeletons look like ours. They would have been as tall as us. They would have been within the range of human anatomy that you see today if you gave them modern haircuts and modern clothes.
I mean, not exactly. So you could, like if you train a machine learning model, it could tell you very quickly if somebody is from 200,000 years ago. So in particular, their brain case was not nearly as globular as ours is now. But they had some traits that were not had before then. And so it's kind of a loose definition of anatomically modern, but they wouldn't necessarily be confused with humans now. They're not like within the normal range.
Yeah. I see. So I think what you're saying is, if you do something quantitatively precise and you actually look at things in detail, you can tell differences between skeletons from that long ago and today. But if you were to just sort of transplant one of those humans to today and give them clothes and you saw them on the subway or something, you wouldn't necessarily look twice.
I mean, you'd say that's a race I haven't seen before.
Really?
I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, I haven't seen them because they're 200,000 years ago.
Yeah. How do we know that exactly?
So there's a lot of differences, and it's a fairly gradual change from archaic to anatomically modern.
Yeah.
And so you just have to pick a point. And so certainly the variation of modern humans now, like of extant modern humans, it's not greater than the distance between now and 200,000 years ago. Like all humans have gotten a lot more gracile than back then.
And explain, what does that mean, gracile?
Slender would be another way to say it.
I see. So the skeletons are a little bit less robust.
Yes. So they, they were the robust up until about 40,000 years ago. Most skeletons were robust.
Okay. So, but there's so there is this gradual change, but there's this sort of notion of anatomically modern humans, and then I don't know, what would we call like culturally or cognitively modern humans? Like something happened after a couple 100,000 years ago and behavior changed. How would you characterize sort of this difference between anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity?
I mean, so the most common model is that there's something related to symbolic thought from like 100,000 to especially 50,000 years ago. And that is the biggest difference. So you get things like narrative art, or art at all. So even crosshatches in in eggshells start about 100,000 years ago, and then by 50,000 years ago, you'll get scenes of say it's somewhere in Indonesia where there's a scene of a group of people hunting a pig. And that's 51,000 years ago or so.
Yeah, yeah.
And so but it's all over the world about at that time where you get what we would call behavioral modernity.
Yeah.
And that's also highly, highly debated when that starts.
Yep.
There's a paper. We don't need to get into it right now. We'll go back to
we'll get into some of that. But I mean, it's sort of the very coarse-grained idea here is that for some extended period of time, and we're talking in relative terms here, but for probably hundreds of thousands of years, the Homo sapiens that were around, in theory, like they should have been able to do sort of the things that subsequent humans did in terms of their brain power. Like they had big cranial volumes, but at some point, tens of thousands of years ago, 50,000 years ago, whatever it is, at some point there seems to be, scare quotes, sudden shift. And suddenly now you kind of see art and all of these cultural artifacts that you didn't really see before for a more extended period of time.
Yeah, and also to complicate things, this is the exact moment where Homo sapiens take over the world.
Right.
And so before that, there were in our genus about 5 extant species. So the Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo longi, and these are just the ones that have been given names.
Right. So there's different subspecies of humans all over the world, several at least, could be more. And basically, at some point, Homo sapiens, our subspecies, at some point begins radiating out of Africa, and there's a little debate on the details there, but it happens tens of thousands of years ago, quickly spreads over much of the globe, and more or less displaces all the other species.
Mm-hmm.
And so this sort of roughly at least coincides with this eruption of what we might call cultural or behavioral modernity, where quote unquote, all of a sudden, like the humans seem to be doing and behaving in a very different way than they were before, even though their predecessors were phenotypically more or less the same.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, this is basically the standard model.
Okay. Okay. So as I understand your idea, and I happened upon this some time ago, and it's kind of a provocative idea. It's very interesting. It's going to sound maybe far-fetched, but I don't actually think this type of thing is as far-fetched as it seems at first blush, and hopefully that's what we unpack for people. But I think your idea is the Eve theory of consciousness. It's that when this higher order consciousness evolved, so as opposed to primary consciousness, these are my terms, that this is how I use them, so we can discuss that. People might have different ways they use terminology with this stuff, but we're not talking about primary consciousness here, the type of awareness that probably all animals have. But there's something we might call higher order consciousness, and that is basically the capacity for metacognitive self-awareness. I'm aware that I am aware. I can talk about my awareness. I can talk about the evolution of our awareness in conversation with you. It's this kind of ability that is often pointed to as the thing in humans that sort of sets us apart from most other species. It's the special thing. And it may very well be connected to the thing that sort of erupted to initiate behavioral or cultural modernity, whatever we want to call it. And so your idea here, that's a little bit different from other ideas that have been put out there, and there's been lots of different ideas that we'll probably discuss. Your idea is that this higher order form of consciousness arose first in females. So there was a sex difference. It came first in women, and it was not so much present in men. And also that it may have been precipitated by the ritual use of something like snake venom in sort of cult ritual behaviors. So people were using snake venom in rituals. Somehow this precipitated this emergence of metacognitive awareness or some new cognitive ability in women. And then the women taught it to the men. And that all of this stuff is perhaps even encoded in ancient myths which have persisted for long periods of time, such as the Garden of Eden myth.
Exactly. I mean, we're done here, right? That's
okay. So that's basically the idea that I'm going to talk to you about. You're going to unpack for us, but I just wanted to put it out there at the beginning so people sort of know where we're going, because it's pretty interesting stuff. But okay, let's get back to this idea of anatomically modern humans, behavioral modernity, and sort of when this stuff happened. Can you give us a little bit more on behavioral modernity, when it arose, and sort of, I don't know, give us some tent posts here of what sort of the major ideas are about when and how this may have happened?
Yeah, so one of the earliest examples is Blombos Cave.
Yeah.
And so there's a famous cross-hatched stone that was etched into. And it's a nice design, but it's not of anything. So that was about
Yeah.
70,000 years ago
It's
in
just
South
cross sections,
Africa.
lines
Yeah,
that
yeah.
intersect. It's abstract. It's not an icon of some animal or something.
Yeah, and at the same time in the Near East as well as among Neanderthals in Europe, you start getting burials,
Mm,
which are interpreted usually as a sign of understanding that there's something more than the material world. Like there's some
yeah.
spark that is in you that
Yeah. Yeah.
is no longer when you die. So that's
Yeah.
especially when it's ritual
Right. Right.
burial.
And even if, I guess, burials are a key thing because most species don't do them, even if, it could mean that people had a concept of, they had concepts like abstract concepts in their mind, that they had maybe a concept of an afterlife or whatever. But even if they weren't sort of there yet, it would at least mean that they understood. I guess the sort of the tamest interpretation of early burials is, well, maybe they merely knew that the body could turn rancid and become infectious and make you sick or whatever and get nasty. So they wanted to get away from it. Even that would imply some level of knowledge that there's things there unseen that you need to separate yourself from or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually don't know. So you have a podcast on mind and matter. Surely you have some thoughts about the human special sauce.
Yeah, I mean, I think I I probably, presumably, more or less align with you. I think, if I understand you correctly. So I think, I'm echoing different thinkers here. A lot of people have thought about this and talked about this. So
Hmm.
it's hard to credit individual people, but I think the metaphor of a software update is, at least roughly accurate. Our brains were phenotypically powerful enough at some point to do all the things, probably, or most of the things we're capable of today. And yet there's this period of time where there seems to be this gap. So we presumably have this brain power to do language and metacognitive awareness and all of
So
this
I
stuff.
think the evidence that we had the brain power to do that is pretty weak. Like we can get into that. I first want to hear about like the special sauce, but
Yeah, well,
I think going back, I think that there must have been genetic changes.
I think there probably were genetic changes that helped support the development of this, probably earlier in life, and sort of help bootstrap things. But I think the sort of the key thing here for me, at least, is that I think there's certain things that we now routinely train into the minds of young children that we just sort of think of as being automatically there, which aren't necessarily automatically there, right?
Yeah,
So there's
like
some.
pronouns, for
Yes.
example.
So there's some, there's, if we use a machine learning example, the way that we're training young minds today may be very different from what it was, tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago. I don't know what the cutoff date is, but there could very well have been people that had some of the self-reflective capabilities in principle, but that those things weren't actually expressed because the early mind wasn't trained in the ways that we take for granted now.
Hmm.
And what that training is, I'm not exactly sure, but it's going to be bound up with how we pay attention to and speak to young children and things like this. But clearly, if you think about the history of language evolution, so someone I draw on here a lot is Terence Deacon, who I've spoken to on the podcast a couple of times. But if you sort of just imagine running human history in reverse, we know that language is preferentially acquired in young minds, right? Their brains are differently able to learn languages compared to the adult mind. If you just imagine going back further and further in time to this hypothetical origin of language, it must have first arose in older minds. I don't think it rose spontaneously
Yes.
in a child one day.
So Deacon doesn't talk about that, does he?
Oh, yes, yeah.
He thinks it arose in older minds.
Yeah. So Deacon's basic thesis, as I understand it, and he did talk about this on, I think, the second podcast I did with him, is I'm going to greatly compress this right now, but it's probably the original quote unquote language or proto language probably emerged in a subset of adults in, bands of humans that were
Uh-huh.
performing behavioral rituals. And, at first these probably involved, just making relatively simple, I don't know if I want to say grunts, but vocalizations. And so the earliest proto languages were probably bound up with an enacted ritual. Was it a marriage ritual? Was it, a sacrificial
Mhm.
food ritual or so? Who knows? But it would probably came from that and was much more limited in scope. And then over time, that becomes elaborated, and the adults slowly, gradually start, teaching this to children. And over time, languages became adapted to the young mind in the sense that the things that evolve in languages are things. The things that are innovated in languages tend to be innovated by young minds. You can see that in the present day with like creoles and things like this. So you mix these two language groups together somewhere, and sort of the next generation starts spontaneously elaborating new parts of the grammar and new words and things. So over time, the idea is this sort of like this proto language that would have first been in only some adults in human groups for which this evolved, slowly migrated earlier and earlier in development until it became, what we would recognize today as a full-fledged language.
Yeah, yeah. So my model is pretty similar
Mm-hmm.
to Deacon's, just the time frame is
Mm-hmm.
very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
So Deacon, I believe, says that the the symbolic culture emerged 2 million years ago. And so he'll point to like Acheulean hand axes. He'll say, I believe he uses the argument that they're more beautiful than they necessarily have to be. They're more symmetric.
Mm-hmm.
And so
there's potentially more there than just the raw functional need to have a hand axe.
yes, yes. So he argues symbolic thought goes back all the way with tool use 2 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually look for symbols, like they're really not there till like 100,000 with burial, and then 50,000 with symbolic art.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
this
so
is so before, yeah. So I want to get your take here in particular, but I think a key point for all this stuff is like there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of different interpretations as to like where you draw some of these lines. Like, when did symbolic cognition actually evolve? How do we know that? Do we kind of infer it indirectly from these hand axes, or do we need to see like a bona fide symbol painted on a cave? And there's a lot of diversity of opinion here, right?
Yeah, and so I'll give my case for symbolic thought evolving from like 100,000 years ago, and then a lot of it happening in the last 50,000 years ago as well.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about the case for 2 million years as well, because I think that's the other most natural place to say it evolved. But the case for the last 100,000 is, well, that's the only time we see symbols.
Yeah.
So that's, if you look for the rock art, it's there. Starting 50,000 years ago. And the symbol I'm most interested in is, I think that once you start getting some separation of subject and object, a symbol that naturally forms is I. And so I think that at the very beginning of this process, I was probably experienced in an extremely fragmented state. And I think that the people that became better formed in first, that tended to be women. And that they basically came up with methods to teach I am, to help people experience that
to
as
train
they
the
developed.
mind to do this thing.
Yes, and so you come up, I mean, it's a wild idea, but it makes a prediction. So you should find some cultural, like secret knowledge or sacred knowledge that was invented by women and is the foundation of society or of culture, that involves some sort of ceremony that could reasonably teach I am. And so that's what I write about a lot, is because that's what I'm interested in searching for. So is there some example of that? And how old was it? When did it spread? All of this. So we can get into the bull roar, but it looks like you have some questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to cue people to where we're going. So we're going to need to talk about like ritual practices and how they're used historically in human beings. That ties into some of the things that you just said. Creation myths and sort of secret societies and
Yeah.
mystery cults and things like this. A lot of this stuff ties together, I think, in interesting ways. But basically, you said there's roughly, everything that we're going to say, we're going to have to say roughly speaking or approximately or whatever a lot, because there's a lot of diversity of thought here. But roughly speaking, there's people who think that symbolic cognition and the quote unquote special sauce is quite recent, meaning tens of thousands of years old. It sounds like you're more in that camp. And then there are other people who think it could be, maybe 1 or 2 million years old. Is that fair, you think?
Yeah, that's a fair summation.
Okay, so give us the case. So unpack the case for it being older. Why do people sometimes argue that?
So because it becomes quite problematic in that so one of the reasons is there was this pretty simple story. So the model I suggested of the last 100,000 and then something big happening 50-ish thousand years ago.
Yeah.
That was the dominant model up to like 2000 or so.
Mm-hmm.
However, then they started to do DNA analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that the human groups have been separated if you look at the Y chromosome, or if you look at the mtDNA or the mitochondrial DNA, it seems like that the last common ancestor is about 200,000 years old. Mm-hmm. And then also that happens to line up with what had previously been established as kind of anatomical modern.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And then there's also looking at the autosomal DNA. There are some groups like the Khoisan who've been separated for about 300,000. And separated, I mean, we broke off for them or they broke off from us. But just genetically, we've been apart for quite a long time. Yeah.
And I guess...
go ahead.
I guess the potential problem here, I think I know how you get around this, but the potential problem here is, okay, if all humans living today have common ancestor that's, 200,000 to 300,000 years old, going back that far or further, and we make the assumption that this special sauce is somehow, if it's got a genetic basis or something, then it becomes difficult to explain how it spread if we all literally inherited it from a common ancestor that goes back at least that far. And so therefore, this thing must have evolved earlier than that. Is that?
Yes, that's accurate? Precisely.
Yeah.
So there's, I really like the book, The Recursive Mind by, was it Michael Corballis? So he's a linguist and a psychologist, and he says, like, I am certain that there's been no cognitive evolution in the last 200,000 years.
Yeah.
But so he has the book is mostly great. So he outlines all of the things that recursion can do for you. The way it allows you to speak a symbolic language. It allows for metacognition, all of this. He thinks it's a very tight package. Yeah. But he just can't point to any examples of recursion in the last 200,000 years ago.
There's some deep need inside of him for it needing to be old, but you're basically saying he can't quite point to anything concrete. It's just sort of this belief.
Yes. And it's also, he's not an archaeologist, so he's not going to like go to war. He's just he just kind of accepts the kind of standard timeline when he wrote the book, which was 2012 or so. Yeah. But he does include a paragraph. So he has I'm certain there's been no cognitive evolution, that if we had a time machine and got somebody from 200,000 years ago.
Well, I would say that's now demonstrably false, because even in just the past the last several years, there's so much now population genetic evidence from these ancient DNA studies showing not only has there been cognitive evolution in the last 200,000 years, but there's been cognitive evolution in less than 20,000 years.
And extreme. So you're referring to the David Reich paper,
yes,
or I guess we should say pre-print. I don't think it's been published yet.
It's hasn't been published quite yet, but that and other work in that realm is, it's clearly showing that there's been significant adaptation since the advent of agriculture, basically.
Yeah, and so that work is it's surprising because he showed the predicted genetic potential of IQ being like 65 for people living just 10,000 years ago. So that was
Really?
the average. Yeah, yeah. It was 2.3 standard deviations lower.
Which is
So people
that's an
did
extreme
not
difference.
extreme difference. And so like how much do you, I don't
Yeah.
know. It's
It's
a
I mean,
new
that's
it's
big
a
enough
new
that it's kind of hard to
field.
believe.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean it works well with my theory. So I'm not exactly saying it's not true.
Right,
But
right.
if stuff like that pans out, and
Yeah.
that's another thing. I really am an empiricist.
Yeah.
I'm glad that I've been writing on this for like 3 years or so.
Hmm.
And so when I wrote, I made a lot of claims. Like I think that there's been selection against schizophrenia, and that was one of the other traits that now
Yes.
we have evidence that there have been strong selection against schizophrenia.
Yes.
And that was I think that's a prediction that I got right.
Hmm. Hmm. So, okay. I mean, let's,
That's so I want to where I want to
okay.
go back to um kind of normalizing my model
Okay. Okay.
also about the transition between um to behavioral modernity.
Okay.
So not that long ago, I happened upon the work of Tom Froese, and he's a cognitive scientist at the University of Okinawa. And about a decade ago, he published the ritualized mind alteration hypothesis.
Hmm.
And in that, he argues that the proliferation of cave art we see is the result of altered states. But not only that, it's us evolving metacognition.
Hmm.
And so we're building up these recursive loops, and that's why you see all these recursive
Yep.
patterns
Yep.
is one of the things. But it's also he articulates that we were just having subject object separation,
Yeah.
and then there were different rites in these temples
Yeah.
which they would practice that would force subject object operate
I see.
separation.
Yeah. And so this, like, I think where you're going with this, what we've been talking about here, this is a very different way of thinking about the evolution of the special sauce, quote unquote.
Yeah.
It's very different from something like the classic Chomskyan view, where Chomsky, I don't know if he still believes this, but the sort of classic Chomskyan view was there was a freak mutation one day in an individual, and this baby was born that could do
Mm-hmm.
recursion, and it was like this genetic thing that happened freakishly. The types of things you're talking about now is that no, this stuff was sort of trained into the mind, and this required some kind of like ritual practice to bake in to the minds that were already there.
Yeah, so I like Chomsky on linguistics. So
Mm-hmm.
I really really like recursion,
Mm-hmm.
and so he did great work there. However, yeah, his model of evolution it's not within the bounds of science, I would say.
Yeah, it's
I
basically
he's
it's like saying there's a miracle. One day something happened.
Yeah, and we have such strong evidence from twin studies
Yeah,
that
yeah,
IQ and all of personality is incredibly heritable. So your language ability is incredibly heritable,
yeah.
and there's no one gene for it. There's a
Right.
bunch.
Yeah, we that's
And
proven,
and
I
so
would
his
say.
model, like his model is absolutely just false. I think we can say
Hmm.
with high confidence.
His model of the classic evolution he has of the evolution, the classic model he has of the evolution of language.
Yeah, and also another thing. So he really wasn't interested in the truth or understanding what happened. So he started out by saying 50,000 years was when this happened,
Yeah.
because that's when there's evidence of recursion. Like if you just look at the archaeological record. But then later he starts saying 100,000. I think towards the end, like 200,000. Anyway, he slowly moved the date back as you get some sort of basically as the scientific culture of when it would be convenient for the special sauce to have emerged
Yeah.
changed.
Hmm.
He just pushed that back and back and back. Um, but I mean, he never spoke that much
Yeah.
about why it would be that moment,
Yeah.
right? And so it was just kind of
Yeah. He just had to
in
declare
different
there was a
interviews I
moment.
saw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So going back to these other ideas.
The Oh yeah, so the
Yeah.
ritualized mind alteration hypothesis.
Who was that you were talking about? What was the name?
This is Tom Frost. So
Okay.
he's the editor-in-chief of Adaptive Behavior.
Okay.
So this isn't like some rando.
Yeah.
This is and he so I had him on my podcast, and like he still likes this this idea that he proposed. And his idea was that like, how can you teach somebody subject-object separation?
Yeah.
Well, you can bring them very close to death. It is one way. So there's kind of like a simulated death, and then you would be a death and rebirth sequence, this ritual. And along with that, so you can do this by, so a lot of initiation ceremonies do just physically, they bring your body close to death. And so there's going to be a lot of fasting,
I see.
and pain, and sometimes even bloodletting.
Right.
And then also,
we can probably all think of examples of, it's very common in traditional societies to have pretty extreme rituals that have things like extreme fasting, extreme amounts of pain, initiation rites, like that's a very common motif.
Yes. And he also suggests that that psychedelics, particularly psilocybin mushrooms, could have been involved.
Yeah.
And so he was involved. There's pretty if you look at his papers, pretty rancorous back and forth between people who are like, no, there couldn't have been any evolution this late, or basically saying you have no evidence that humans would have used psychedelics at that time.
Yeah.
That also, anyways, I'm sure that you've seen a lot of it's just
yeah. Well,
it's very divisive, right?
Yeah.
The idea that psychedelics could be involved.
Yeah, but let's just so I want to sort of anticipate maybe a possible counter argument to some of the things we're discussing. So let's just let's assume for the sake of argument that some of this stuff is accurate. Okay, you needed to have some kind of fairly extreme ritual that brought you close to death, and some kind of ritual like that was how subject-object distinctions and the concept of I got trained into human minds. So that type of training was necessary for us to have a sense of I and to have this subject-object distinction. It's like, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that's how things started and where they came from. Today, most of the people walking around that we are friends and family and peer people, our peers, they, I didn't go through some kind of ritual like this when I was a kid, but I developed subject-object distinction just fine. Why don't we need that today?
So first, I think that our culture is just much more advanced. Like the type of memes that we show children are very, very different now than then. And before I brought up pronouns, but you can imagine basically trying to teach this before they had pronouns. And then once you get this part of language, it's reinforcing this structure in brains from a very, very young age.
I see. So in a sense, what you're saying is it might happen now, quote unquote, for free, because our language has all of these features that sort of, it's sort of baked into the language now. But at some point, there weren't pronouns. There weren't words that had built into them subject-object distinctions. And somehow you would have had to bake this into minds without having that language scaffold sort of preformed.
Yes, exactly. And then, so the other thing is, I think that we've evolved. So it used to be very hard to teach somebody I am, but now it's much easier. And it's because those that could learn I am are the people who survived. And so you really, for this model to work, you have to show strong selection on ability to learn I am. And so that's why I'm interested in the ancient DNA stuff.
I see. And that fits a lot with, I think, what someone like Deacon would say, which is that, so on the one hand, this is like a cultural innovation that doesn't start with like a Chomskyan mutation. And yet, once this sort of process gets started, there would be selection to learn it better and earlier in life, because to the extent that this recursive ability was adaptive, obviously the more of it you have faster, earlier in life, the better it is going to be for your group. And so there would have been selection. There would have been a selective advantage on any individuals who had any type of brain mutation, such that they were able to better and or more quickly learn this ability that was probably very strenuous to learn initially. Okay, so that's rough. That's basically in line with what you're saying. with your ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of research on, okay, what genes have been selected for in the last 50,000 years, or
Yeah.
usually not quite 50,000. But it does cluster around cognitive, which makes sense, because even if you don't believe that something like consciousness or I am emerged, certainly there's more complex society, there's art. Like,
Yeah.
art is going to change the
Yeah.
fitness landscape.
Yeah.
And so I don't think you can really get around that.
Yeah.
There's also our brains, the shape of our skulls has changed quite a bit in the last 50,000 years.
Yeah. 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 It is like you can even think about like even very, very short time scales. Like if you go back, if what was that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where it's like a dream within a dream within a dream? Inception.
Yeah, yeah.
I think if you showed that to someone who's born in like 1900, they would be like, well, like, what the fuck are you showing me right now? I don't even know
Yeah,
if they
yeah.
could like really like get it. But for us now, it's just like, yep, that's just like the movie this year. And it's because like our entire culture and the language and how we talk about stuff, it's changed in just that amount of time, and that provides a scaffolding that makes something that would otherwise be totally baffling an enjoyable movie in this case.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the ideas you have is that consciousness, this type of self-reflective consciousness. So whenever we say consciousness, I think by default that's what you and I are talking about in this conversation. I'll let you put more meat on the bone there if you want, but this kind of self-reflective self-consciousness, that it came first in women rather than men. Unpack that a little bit. Why do you think that? Where does that come from? What is the support for that idea?
So a lot of this goes back to evolutionary psychology. There's a comparative advantage in that women have in theory of mind and language.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, because of differences in upper body strength, not going to win a fight with fists, and so put more stats into social cognition.
Mm-hmm.
So the pretty basic evolutionary psychology. Actually, so was it Robin Dunbar? In his book, Gossip, Grooming, and Language, he actually mentions this, that women would have invented language because it's more important for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it needs to be, because they are physically at a disadvantage in many ways.
Yeah, yeah, and also funny enough, Terence McKenna also, this is part. He mentions this in what, The Food of the Gods.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. He also says women were first, but it's so anyway. This is not like a fringe idea. And people who I think that it's almost a requirement of the social brain hypothesis. So if you think we became smart because of being social,
Yeah.
I think that you must believe that women kind of became human first. I just think that's a requirement.
Because otherwise, it's very, very difficult to explain why they would consistently perform better on things like theory of mind, etc.
Yeah, yeah. So there's so I do have an interest in psychometrics. The tool that they use to measure emotional intelligence. So it's just a survey. Like, I don't know, do you grab the door to help people get out? Like, do you notice other people? Can you understand what they're thinking?
Mm-hmm.
And so in psychometrics, there's no real ground truth. And so they have to demonstrate when they come up with a new survey, does this actually capture what we say? And so they gave it to a group of therapists and to a group of prisoners, and they show, hey, the average is different between these two groups. So like, it's probably measuring emotional intelligence. And they also give it to men and women, and they're like, hey, women do better. Therefore, this must be like, this is support that it's measuring emotional intelligence. Mm. So in the actual tools, it's just considered like a thing, a priori, that women are going to do better on emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so keep going for us. So other than this sort of general belief that it came first in women because they tend to score higher in measures of what we can just call social intelligence, I mean, is there anything more to it than that?
So I had that belief, and then I had an anonymous or a pseudo-anon blog where I just blogged about machine learning and psychology. And I was really interested in there's higher order structure to the big five.
Mm-hmm.
And above the big five in personality, there's something called the general factor of personality. However, for our purposes, it's just, you can think of it as kind of emotional intelligence or social self-regulation.
Okay.
And I was trying to think, like, what if personality is a cybernetic system or a fitness landscape,
Mm-hmm.
what would this main factor be causing to be selected for? And so it was just kind of a fun blog post. I was just going to write, I was describing what the GFP was, some of the debates around it, and then say, okay, and what would it have us evolve? And so I started thinking about, it would have us evolve a conscience, because it's about like your theory of mind and also doing right by other people.
Yeah, how you fit into the social group. Yeah, how everyone's getting along. I mean, all these things would come along with that type of factor.
And I just was imagining back in evolutionary time, like, what would that, like, okay, you evolve a conscience, and then what's next? And I thought, what would it be like to identify with your conscience? What would that moment be like?
Yeah.
And so because I was trying to write an article, like, you want to come have some metaphor, and then it struck me, Genesis is an extremely good metaphor for the moment. So the fall of Adam and Eve is an extremely good metaphor for realizing that you are your conscience.
Yeah, the idea would be that you are falling into that realization.
Yes, the kind of, you are the man behind the curtain. It's where they went wrong was eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And so having some sort of metacognition on top of your agency, I think would be extremely painful. Painful in ways that only humans can understand. And you can imagine that feeling like falling out of the Garden of Paradise. And one of the things that interests me is, like, Eve ate the apple. So it's an extremely patriarchal story. So why is it such a good metaphor for this? And then two, why does it agree with evolutionary psychology that Eve would have eaten the apple?
Right.
And so I was just imagining, like, if somebody realized, like, I'm the man behind the curtain, and they taught other people, it seems like men would be kind of the last in on this knowledge.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine as kind of a cultural memory of this moment. And so then there's the obvious question, okay, how long can a myth last? And so I've done a bunch of research on that. And so there's overlap. There's overlap between how long a myth can last and when we started acting human.
Yeah. So where you're going with this is that when we think about creation myths, the Christian creation myth, the Garden of Eden, is one of the best known examples to all of us because of the time in history and the places that we live. But we're going to talk about other creation myths as well. But where you're going with this is that this is not an arbitrary, fictitious story that was simply made up for entertainment or whatever. It is actually an encoding of what you're arguing are actual historical events, and it's symbolic and there's fictional elements to it, but these things are pointing to something that was very real. And if that general notion is true, there are a few things that have to be true if we're going to come to that conclusion. One is that these stories are not, they are symbolic, but they're not totally fictitious and arbitrary. Two is that they are able to persist and retain that information for long periods of time, despite spreading all over the world. And I think maybe a third would be that, we should see sort of the core essence of this story conserved across creation myths that are different in their details. Is that fair?
Yeah, all of that is very fair.
Okay.
So what my response, I had this kind of wild idea, and I just knew the Christian creation myth.
Yeah.
And so a requirement of this model is that all creation myths also describe this moment of realization. So I just started reading creation myths, which is good to do, even if it's just good to know.
Yeah.
And so there's a surprising thing. So for example, Egyptians, the world comes into being when Atom, the god, the primordial god, says his own name. And so it is also, it's like, okay,
In the
there's
beginning was
it
the
all,
word.
yeah,
It's
it all
yeah,
starts with the word, like in this case would be I am. He
yeah.
spoke his name, Atom. And then the first thing he does is fight a snake. And then
Yeah, it's like nobody knows this if you didn't study Egyptian mythology before. Be like, wait a minute, I knew the Adam and Eve story with the snake and the Adam and the apple. You're just like, okay, this is strikingly similar in that way.
yes, and then so China has Nuwa and Fuxi,
Mm-hmm.
and so they are so Nuwa is like Eve,
Yeah.
and then Fuxi would be Adam, and they are always drawn with snakes
Hmm.
as their torso
Hmm.
wrapped around one another. So there's once again there's like a first couple with snakes.
Yeah.
If you read so in North and South America, they have the creation myths tend to involve an emergence. So there's different worlds and they're progressively more human-like.
Okay.
So I think we're in the fourth or fifth one, the current world. But in the third one, Spider Grandma, among the Hopi, the Spider Grandma teaches them morals.
Hmm.
So you can see, like, once again, there's like a woman, and
A
the
woman, an
change is about
animal.
morality,
Yeah.
and
There's
also venomous
a
animal.
venomous animal.
And so,
So you noticed that motif was coming up all over the world in these creation myths.
yeah, and so like I knew about the stoned ape hypothesis,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I thought, hey, can you get high on snake venom?
Yeah. So
And
before we go there, just for people who don't know, cover very briefly what is that stoned ape theory from McKenna? What does it essentially say?
so his theory is that we have been doing we've been eating mushrooms for a long time, like 200,000 years. And then it was a gene culture interaction that mushrooms somehow made us more amorous and open, and it was good
Mm-hmm.
for passing on
Yeah.
genes.
The idea
And
was that
then
psilocybin mushrooms, psychedelic ingestion, precipitated this kind of cognitive shift.
yes. Um, yeah, so not taken seriously. So it's a Joe Rogan
Right,
theory.
right,
Is like
right.
he's kind of the we should say steward of the theory at this point.
Yeah.
But there is some work among academics to also take it seriously.
Yeah. And then there's like, probably, one of the things that hooks into this is like the book that Brian Murarescu wrote. I talked to him on the very first episode of the podcast, actually. Basically,
Oh, really?
there's a field called archaeochemistry, and there is evidence to suggest that at least thousands of years ago people were drinking psychedelic concoctions potentially with alkaloids not too dissimilar to LSD and things, and those were part of these sort of secret rituals.
Yeah, and so I definitely want to come back to his book and the Greek
Yeah,
mystery
yeah.
cults. But yeah, where are we right now?
So let's get back. So creation myths, you notice this motif is all over Egyptian myths, Chinese myths, the Christian myth. And we're just talking about like how common it was. And it always involves a woman and saying I am at the beginning. There is the word, and there's always this kind of venomous animal around, whether it's a snake or a spider or what have you. So
Yeah,
all these things are bubbling around. Yeah.
Not always, but it's enough to strike you. So especially
Yeah.
the snake thing just hits
Yeah.
you over the head. So what
Yeah.
I think that I'm not a particularly nuanced reader of literature,
Mm-hmm.
and yet like here it's just right there. It's in every one of them. There's a snake.
And so okay, so where did you go from there? You sort of noticed this. You had some of these ideas in your head.
And so I just Googled, can you get high from snake venom? And you totally can. Like you totally can. There's a small literature on this, mostly in India, where they have instead of like they have snake dens, they call them, instead of like an opium
Today.
den. Yeah, today. There are clinics where people go for snake venom or scorpion venom, like addiction rehab.
What?
It's a real thing. So this was people laughed at me when I posted this on Reddit. It was people hated the snake venom shit. However, there was just this year a famous YouTuber in India was arrested for selling cobras and crates at a rave in India.
What?
Yeah,
Okay,
there
but
is.
hold on, but just tell me, like, what do people actually do? If I'm at the
They
rave and I
take
buy a
a
cobra, what do I do with it?
they take a bite on their tongue.
What? From the cobra?
Yeah,
Like they touch the fang?
yeah. So there's like I have seen footage of there was I link it in one of my pieces, one of my
Like
later
Indian
pieces.
kids at a rave do this on
I don't
purpose.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I don't know, there are snake charmers that's your dealer. Apparently
Oh,
there's a thing. It's a
there's more
thing.
to the snake charmers that meets the eye.
Yeah, so it's good. So a blog is great because you can just kind of write shit.
Yeah.
Um, and so I found a lot of the evidence for snake venom as an entheogen after I wrote it. I just found so you can Google it and it comes right up. But
I
so
see.
for example, the arrest didn't happen. Anyway,
Yeah.
I have much better evidence because it's what I get the most pushback on, and so I
Yeah.
spent a
Yeah.
lot of time.
Okay,
Actually,
so just
go
I'll
ahead.
pause here real quick. I want to make sure I fully understand this. There's people to this day in places like India getting high on snake venom. They will buy a snake on purpose at literally at a rave in some cases, and they
Yes.
touch the fang of the cobra to their tongue. What happens? What do they report? Is it like a euphoria they get? Like what happens?
Yeah, so I actually don't know too well why. So why aren't they dying, for example? So
Yeah,
I don't know if there's a different diet they give
yeah,
to these snakes or if they
yeah,
milk them so much.
yeah.
I
It could
don't
be a
know
dose
any
dependent
of
thing. It
that.
could be swallowing it rather than having it injected into your veins. But what do they report as why are people wanting to do this?
So I haven't seen any reports from the raves, and
Yeah.
it's weird. So I have looked for it, but the raves don't report it. There's in the literature from in the scientific literature.
Yeah.
The people mention taking it, and then so there's convulsions, there's sometimes even paralysis, there's feeling sleepy. There's a lot of them report bliss.
Hmm.
There's hallucinations. There's some really interesting reports where somebody who had been addicted to opiates and alcohol for a decade, they took this and then they just went cold turkey
Huh.
off of the other substances, and then they just like every couple months would go get a snake bite.
Wow.
So
Roughly,
very
yeah.
strange.
Roughly speaking, it sounds like maybe something in the ballpark of ketamine or ibogaine or something like that. Like maybe a deliriant or a dissociative of some kind. And it's not, I mean, I'm not an expert on snake venom, but I do know that many of the venoms that have evolved are basically, they're often modified proteins that act, on receptors and at synapses in the brain, and they do have neuro effects. They are that is their evolved function in some cases. So it's certainly not I've had never heard this before I read some of your stuff, but it's at least not a stretch to think that there could be some snake venoms that would have a psychoactive effect.
Yeah, I mean, if I had said like um, toad venom, nobody
Yeah.
would have a problem with this.
Right. Right.
Um, but so there's, for example, there's Sadhguru is a guru in India with a huge following, millions and millions. And he, at the dedication of some temple, he drank snake venom. And
Yep.
so he like so
Just
there
drink it.
is he drank it. And so his report, he talks about the disassociative effects
Mm.
of snake venom. He talks about like disassociating and also the death and rebirth. So he says
Yeah.
like snake venom killed me,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it taught me something more valuable. I mean, some shit to this
Yeah.
effect.
And it's,
It's on my article if you want to see
yeah.
the direct quote.
Yeah, I mean, what's sort of interesting here about, so the idea that to train I into the human mind required some kind of ritual that brought you to the precipice of death, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
When you think about psychedelics and dissociatives, anything from psilocybin to ketamine, on a high enough dose, the essence of the experience is just that. You lose your sense of self, you dissociate from your normal waking consciousness, and then you
Yeah.
come back to it. And the coming back to it and seeing that distinction really leaves an impression on people that never leaves
Yes.
them.
Yeah, and I think of it some like it relaxes your prior
Yes.
is kind of the
Yes.
Bayesian way
That
to
would be
say
the
it.
Bayesian way of talking about that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this is still it's not like I disbelieve this because it's like, okay, like I guess people even to this day are doing this in India. Are there any more but if this was a creation myth that was worldwide or that you see in many places and the snake motif shows up over and over again, people must have been doing this in other times and places. What do we know about how often snake venom was being intentionally consumed anywhere else in the world or at any other period of time?
Yeah, so the Greek mystery cults, that's another good option. So there's going back, the earliest citations I saw was 20 years ago or so. There have been arguments that snake venom was consumed by, say, the Oracle at Delphi and also in the Eleusinian mysteries.
So writings from that time say that?
Yes. So the father of tragedy. I'm blanking on his name. It's like it's not quite Asclepius. It's anyway, it's something like that.
Yeah.
So he um, he has a play. The
Aeschylus?
Yeah, Aeschylus.
Yeah.
So
So there's an old
he has a
play.
play. I believe it's the Libation Bearers.
Okay.
And he talks about how he calls the priestess a dragoness of the Eleusinian mysteries, and she would bite the initiates, and also that she was bit on her breast by some snake, and then would give the initiates milk, and so it was venom and milk mixed.
Wow.
And then he was put on trial for death for profaning the mysteries
Because he gave away the secret, basically.
Yeah, because it's a mystery cult.
You're
like
not
you
supposed
can't
to know.
say what they do,
Yeah.
or else like you're out of the cult. And the way you get out of the cult is they kill you.
Yeah. Nobody talks about Fight Club. That's the first rule of Fight Club.
Yeah, and so um anyway, there's a guy, Ammon Hillman. He's a PhD in classics, and his dissertation was on this subject. And so he has a few articles where he says explicitly, like, yes, he connects it. He says what they were killing him over was that he said it was snake venom. And then also, so you don't want to go off one person's work, but the guy who coined the term entheogen, he cites that work. So it's Carl Ruck. He just says point blank, like, yes, they were throughout the Mediterranean consuming snake venom as an entheogen.
What's interesting about this is a couple of things tied together here. One, I mean, the fact that there's a record, someone said this and wrote this is interesting in itself. But two, the fact that these were mystery cults, and sort of the whole point of these things is you're not allowed to talk about them outside. This simultaneously gives an explanation for why we don't see more of a record of these things.
Yes.
And that it does appear to have happened, at least according to the limited number of leaks we got.
Yeah. So like what we have so far is an extremely specific prediction. So basically you need a snake cult that was invented by women that spread the entire world.
Yes.
And you don't expect to find that. So that's crazy.
Yeah, that's wild. That's like, yeah, should be pretty easy to disprove in theory. But unpack that for me. So let's assume that did happen. What is the evidence that such a thing spread throughout the entire world, other than the fact that there's these coincidences with the creation myths containing the same motifs?
So there's first there's the sapient paradox. So are you familiar with that?
No, unpack that.
So the sapient paradox is that you start to see behavioral modernity, let's say 50,000 years ago, but it's not really widespread until 10,000 years ago.
So somehow it does spread quickly.
Yeah, so spread independently invented. Maybe it's just kind of a natural progression.
Yeah.
But there's a weird thing. So why is it all at once?
There seems to be a sudden eruption, sudden evolutionary terms. You're talking about
and then also why is it so late some places? So why so for example, one of the things I cite is this paper that argues against behavioral modernity. So it says behavioral modernity can't be real because in Australia, like behavioral modernity is not exhibited until 7,000 years ago. So it's kind of a gambit. It's essentially arguing like, okay, if we think kind of the modern cognition is only 40,000 years old, it's only 40,000 years old in some places. There's a lot of places.
If it arose 40,000 years ago and spread, well, it obviously didn't spread to Australia. So so they're making the argument that that can't be the way it happened.
Yeah, or a more recent example. So think of the Americas.
Yeah.
So there's evidence of that people were here, undisputed evidence 23,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of evidence that's disputed that goes back a long time. So a lot back to 40,000, some back to like 200,000.
Yeah, that's an active area right now, right? If people are arguing over how long people have been in the Americas, and it seems to be getting pushed back.
But how old is art in the Americas?
I have no idea.
About 13,000 years old. So why isn't there art? And so one thing that people, I don't like it when, so for a long time there was Clovis first was a kind of a dominant position, and that was that there were no people in the Americas, and then people came over the Bering Strait about 13,000 years ago, and they filled up the continents. And so the reason that people like that idea was that culture actually is quite similar, and so there was something that spread over both continents at that time. And if there were people before that, what happened to them? And also, why weren't they making art? So I would say, okay, there were people there, but maybe they just weren't conscious. Maybe it was the snake cult that spread through, right? And so that's another kind of another continent where you can see something pretty similar happening. Like what we consider fundamental to human life only seems to be there from around the Holocene.
Yeah, it's like it's a very loose analogy here, but it's like, the mycelial network can spread far and wide, but then you get these eruptions of mushrooms in certain places. Basically what you're saying is, according to the view that you and some others hold, humans could have spread all over the place, but not gotten this new ability yet. And then suddenly, for whatever reason, that thing erupts there because they independently discover the precipitating ritual, or it spreads to them.
No, I don't think it was. I think that somebody discovered it and it spread would be my guess, because it's, for me, I think of in terms of once it exists, it would tend to spread really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think there's not a whole lot of time for it to get invented multiple times, specifically if there's a lot of similarities in between its versions. So
if you had people in some location for a long time and some other people show up, they can quickly spread this aspect of culture to them. And then you get the sudden eruption in those people as well.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so I'm not really making claims about the degree to which humans would have just wiped out other groups or mixed with them. I mean, I'm sure it's different in many different places. And also we'll just see where the genetic stuff leads us. Like that's an empirical question.
Okay, let's
go back to, so we've kind of hinted at bull roars. So the myths are similar. They have snakes all over the world. And so I went looking for the best evidence of global cultural diffusion.
Okay.
And so what I think is the best evidence is bull roar mystery cults.
What is that? What does that word mean?
So the bull roar is an instrument. You tie a bone or a piece of wood that's a kind of a slat, and there's a hole in one side. You tie a string to that and then spin it around, and it makes this kind of roaring or whirling sound. And so it's just an instrument, but it's used in mystery cults around the world. So already that's kind of weird. Is that why this particular instrument? Like why aren't, like, there's flutes and bells. There's all sorts of instruments you could use. Why is this so often at the center? It's often the secret thing at the center of a mystery cult. And there's a couple other facts that make it strange. So in many places, so in a lot of places, the bull roar has been secularized. It's not really remembered as sacred. So in a lot of parts of Europe, although not everywhere, it's just a child's toy. However, when anthropologists started visiting the world, it's like everywhere they went, there'd be mystery cults with, at the center, there's this feared and respected object that was said to be given by God or created by the first person in their tribe.
Wow.
And very often it was said that it was invented by women.
Hmm.
So this is true in Africa and Australia and also in the Amazon.
Mhm.
So highly separated continents. And they say it's invented by women, but men now control the sacred object, as well as the political organization of the mystery cult.
Okay.
And if women see the bull roar, they are put to death.
Hmm.
So it's just a very strange fact pattern
Yeah.
that is extremely widely spread. So you can say, like, of course, the bull roar could be invented many times,
Yeah.
but there's all of these other
Right. Why?
things
Yeah.
about it.
Okay.
And
So it's a recurring
so
motif, but what is it actually used for ritualistically? What do they do with it?
it's usually said to be the voice of God.
Okay.
Or in many places, it's a like a thunder charm.
Hmm.
So to bring rain, so connected with rebirth in that way is part of the literature.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm really not interested. So there's a paper about the use of the bull roar by among the Khoisan.
Hmm.
And there's evidence of them using it. There's rock art of a group of them twirling the bull roar in a cave.
Hmm.
And that's dated between 5
Yeah.
and 10,000 years
Yeah.
ago. So it goes back a long ways.
Yeah. But I guess like one of the themes that you've been getting at here is that, okay, we're talking about culture, we're talking about ideas, we're talking about ritual. If we think about this like an evolutionary biologist, if I'm an evolutionary
Mhm.
biologist and I'm studying birds and lizards or whatever, when I look at phenotypic diversity in the forms of animals, you look for what's different between different lineages, and you look for what's similar. And the
Yes.
things that are most highly conserved are usually the things seen in older last common ancestors, right? Like all tetrapods have 4 limbs because we all shared a last common ancestor that evolved that feature, a really long time ago. And basically what it sounds like you're saying is that when you look at these creation myths and these mystery cults and all of this stuff, these cultures around the world, there's this kind of common core that a lot of their rituals and their mythologies share. And it centers on women being sacred or special in some way, initially commanding or inventing the bull roar or whatever you're talking about. And there is usually some kind of venomous animal like a snake involved. And this realization, this connection to saying I am or being born or reborn, like all of these things seem to be conserved features that speak to a last common ancestor here.
Yes, yes. And the point I was going to make is that I'm interested in bull roars from the last common ancestor perspective.
Yeah.
But maybe it is an active ingredient of the ritual.
Mm-hmm.
So the paper on with the Khoisan, they talk about how it could be helpful for creating all alternate states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's I don't know, it stays at about 40 hertz. And
Yeah.
so they make some argument about brainwaves, stuff like that. So, but I'm more interested in the last common ancestor, culturally speaking.
And so when you look at all of this evidence, you look at all these creation myths, and all of this sort of anthropological, cultural stuff, how far back does that last common ancestor go? What is the date that you come to when you look at when the inferred origin of this may have been?
Yeah, so another reason I love the bull roar is that it's an artifact. So myths, like myths don't leave
It's hard to
material.
date that. Yeah.
But there's bull roars that we can date back to 20,000 years ago in Ukraine. So that's the oldest one that's not really controversial. And so I think, so my model for what happened is that essentially symbolic thought is emerging, and especially among women, I is emerging or forming in a more cohesive state.
Mm-hmm.
And that women made rituals where there were altered states of reality or consciousness. And then somebody gets bit by a snake. And then it's like, hey, that is pretty similar to the song and dance we were doing also produced that effect. And then so you can imagine working in snake bites into the ritual to give it a little bit more punch.
I see.
And so
it's almost like how, there's certain states of consciousness you can get to by taking acid or psilocybin,
Yes.
or through fasting and food deprivation, through chanting and drumming. Like, people often report that you can get to similar states by different routes.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that I think they found the snake
They
venom
found a
route.
catalyst.
And so there was some sort of cult centered around Venus statues. So there's
What
fairly
are
good
those?
evidence for
Explain
that.
what those are for people.
So right into the beginning of behavioral modernity, starting from about 40,000 years ago in Europe, there are these beautiful figurines of women. Um, and that there are actually there are almost no depictions of men until like 15,000 years ago. It's all women, and there are hundreds of them distributed throughout from Spain to Siberia,
Yeah, yeah.
and
So
they
again, all
persist.
over the world, similar cultural
Not all over the
artifact.
world, so just from Spain to Siberia. So
Mhm.
that it's among the Gravettian
Okay.
culture, or it starts in the Aurignacian, but
Yeah.
40,000 years ago. And so I think that there's just these memes stewing, and that
Yeah.
the earliest evidence of that in relation to snake worship would be about 24,000 years ago. There's the Malta Beret culture, and that's in Siberia. And so there's a burials with mini Venus figurines, but there's carved on mammoth tusk. There's three snakes that look like cobras. And on the other side is this totally psychedelic spiral carved in this mammoth tusk.
Hmm.
So very cool artifact, interpreted as snake worship because this is the height of the Ice Age, 24,000 years ago in Siberia. So there probably weren't a lot of snakes
Right. Yeah, I
around.
was going to ask you, like, well, why?
So what's
Yeah,
up with like
what's up with
it's
snakes in
just very
Siberia?
strange to find this.
It makes sense if they already had that in their culture.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So that's you have the Venus statues and perhaps snake worship back 24,000 years ago.
Yep.
This group, so the multiparade culture, genetically, these people are called the ancient North Eurasians, ANE,
Mm-hmm.
and they are the people that populated the Americas.
Yeah. So this would basically, they are my understanding of European population genetic history is basically that all European descended people alive today are basically each some mixture of three ancestral populations. And it sounds like this would be sort of like the population even before that, maybe.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So I forget what they went. I think that Eastern hunter-gatherer
Yeah, that's one of them.
is in large part this ANE
I see.
is
Okay.
their ancestors.
And that makes intuitive sense. So eventually you get these Eastern hunter gatherers, you get the Yamnaya pastoralists, you get the first Neolithic
this
farmers.
is like 5,000 years ago though, and I'm talking
you're
like
talking about
20,
before that. Yeah,
25,000
and
to
roughly,
15,000.
I'm not as big of a history guy as you. So around that time period, what is going on in the world at that time? This is before agriculture has really developed.
Yeah, so you see kind of exactly what you'd expect with metacognition. So what makes humans interesting is that we dominate the environment. That's also part of the fall of Adam and Eve. So they go from living kind of at peace with nature, to, as a consequence of the fall, they become agriculturalists. They, like, by the sweat of their brow shall they eat
They start
their food.
farming. They use animal hides to make clothes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so you see the multiparate culture. This is on the short list for the people who domesticated dogs. So dogs are our first domesticate.
Yeah.
And you can kind of...
Oh, yeah. I was just reading about this. It does line up. It is thought to be maybe 20, 30,000 years old, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. And so you can see maybe starting to have this metacognition, starting the process of domesticating other animals, including ourselves.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the reasons I bring up the dog is it's completely uncontroversial to say the dog went from Eurasia 20,000 years ago to the rest of the world.
Yes, yes.
It's like completely uncontroversial. Like, how did the dingo?
That's a good
How
point.
did the dingo get there?
Right.
It's not like Australia has been hermetically sealed all this time.
Right. Oh, that's a good point. I never
So
thought of that.
I'm saying, like, I'm saying the
Something
snake
else could
also spread from there. And it's interesting because you start, so there's I believe in Brazil, like 11,000 years ago. So right at this transition in the Holocene, they find artwork. There's like a 40-meter cave art of a snake. And so like at this, and it's the kind of at this transition, you suddenly get just enormous interest in snakes. It's the same thing. So there's a huge transition in the early to mid Holocene in Australia. And like, how old do you think? What's the earliest depiction of the rainbow serpent, do you think?
I mean, I have no idea. But if you're talking, I mean, based on everything you're saying, this stuff could go back, multiple tens of thousands of years.
It's just 7,000 years ago.
That's okay, because that fits with what you were saying before with the Australians. You said someone was making the argument, well, you don't see evidence of behavioral modernity in Australia until just a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. So your idea is this originally arose tens of thousands of years ago, potentially somewhere in Eurasia, like you were saying, and then it spread eventually everywhere else. It doesn't get to Australia until 7,000 years ago, even though people had already been there for way longer than that.
Yes.
I see. Okay.
And I'm not that married to the 7,000 date.
Yeah.
Like, who knows? It could have been 15,000. Like, I'm not claiming 7,000.
But people got to Australia like pretty shortly after we came out of Africa. It was one of actually the first places people went to before getting everywhere.
Yeah, and also I'm not so obviously if you speak, you have to simplify things a lot.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like I think, there was just one explosion. No, I mean the human cultural phylogenetic tree is much more of a bush. And so there have been iterations on this and schisms. I don't think that there was just one thing.
Right.
But I do think if we want to talk about the transition from animal to human, that I am and recursion, like those are the two things that we should talk about.
Yeah. Okay, so there's going to be some repetition here, but that's good for people, and I want to make sure I'm following you completely. So lay it out for me sort of again and elaborate a little bit more on this idea that some of this stuff could have originated, you're saying pre-agriculture, 20-something thousand years ago, somewhere in Eurasia. So just lay out again for us. Why do you think that's the time and the place that might be key here?
So it's because of the 20,000 years of the Venus statues.
Yep.
And so you have a pretty good, so if you need to look, women are have a sort of preeminence in the symbolic domain.
Yep.
That's the best fit.
Yeah. So, well, I guess maybe another way of kind of asking what I'm trying to stew over right now is, okay, let's suppose that is true. You would have quickly imagined that you would imagine that from that point in time and space, there would have been now quite a dramatic diffusion of new cultural stuff. Does anything show up that is very substantially different culturally shortly after that, like in that general area? Like, is this when you start seeing more elaborate carvings and like do things really seem to change in that area after this time?
In which area?
Like when you were talking about like in Eurasia, where you start seeing, where you were sort of talking about 20-something thousand years ago, you think that could be the time of the last common ancestor of this.
Yeah. So there's so some archaeologists will even argue that, say, abstract thought is almost non-existent before like 20,000 years ago, and so on various. That's I lead my snake cult essay with a quote to that effect, and so there really is a dearth of that before this time period, and so that's another reason I'd say, like, I mean, that's the transition we have to explain. And so if we have a dual model of human nature where we're both memes and genes, that is kind of where you'd suppose that the memes spread.
So what I mean, and agriculture is supposedly what, like maybe 12,000 years old? What, like, so if some of these things were enabled by the concept of
Yeah.
agriculture, larger scale societies, what's the lag time we see between when you're supposing this cognitive emergence happened and some of these societal changes like the invention of farming or larger scale, more sedentary societies, larger group living, things like that? Like, what's the lag time between those things?
So like, why is there lag time?
Well, why is there lag time, and what is the lag time? How much of a lag do we see when we look
Oh,
at the archaeological record?
I'm not exactly sure. So
Yeah.
I'd go to things like domestication of dog, bull roar,
Yeah.
symbolic thought, with the Venus statues. It's
Mhm.
it's it's a very interesting question. In the end, I think it will be empirical. Just how long do we think it would take to evolve metacognition? It's who knows
Yeah, I don't know.
exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of people. So this is the argument for 2 million years. Is they say, oh, I think it would have taken 2 million years to
Mhm.
evolve
Yeah,
metacognition.
but you're saying it could have happened much faster. In that sense, this is sort of a Julian Jaynes style
Yeah.
idea, in the sense that you're saying, no, this stuff happened much more recently than we often suppose, and it happened relatively quickly.
hmm Yeah, so I actually hadn't read Julian Jaynes until I had this idea, and then obviously I don't know, when I started researching, I'm like what is this business? I like his book a lot. His timeline is pretty whack.
Yeah, he's saying it's even sooner than you're saying, right?
Yeah, 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's that's very, very soon. Um, so what do you think are, I don't know, what are sort of the most key pieces of evidence that would bolster your theory that we could, in principle, that people could go looking for, either in the archaeological record or what have you?
So I think it's going to be the degree to which there's been selection for things like against schizophrenia, for intelligence. If we had a polygenic risk score for age at which you pass the mirror test, I
Yeah,
think that would be extremely interesting.
yeah.
And so I think the genetics is going to be there. I think if archaeology and anthropology become more interested in diffusion, I think there's a lot there. So if you think that all these basic human parts of culture have been there for a long time, why are they so similar? So why is the root of the phylogenetic tree so young? And
Mhm.
so that immediately becomes problematic. If so, for example, the bull roar is no longer really researched in anthropology and archaeology,
Mhm.
because if the most obvious explanation is diffusion, and it's pretty recent, and so it has to be like in the last 20,000 years, and that's just that's not a very popular model in anthropology and archaeology.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you were asking so what's the strongest evidence? I would
No,
say
no, I mean,
why are all the myths so similar? Why
yeah.
are they
No,
such
no, no, no,
good
no, 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 no.
descriptions?
I'm not asking you to recapitulate the evidence that you put forth already. I'm saying, let's
Yeah.
just say you had infinite resources and you could deploy people to look for supporting evidence for your theory that we don't already have. What are some of the things? Where are some of the gaps here? Where are there missing pieces that?
Oh, I would love archaeobotany. So I would love them to find snake venom at Gobekli Tepe.
Mm,
So that, I mean, obviously that would be a big win.
I was going to ask you about that next. Like, when does the Gobekli Tepe, excuse me, line up with this? Was it shortly? Like, was it sort of in this general time frame? Do you think something like that could be related?
Yeah, so that's Gobekli Tepe is Adam eating the fruit.
Hmm. What do
So
you mean it is that? I don't know too much about it.
so Gobekli Tepe, it's about 12,000 years ago
Okay,
in
12,000.
Turkey, and
Yep.
so there's a number of interesting things. So I forget the exact numbers. It's like 50% of the animals that are carved onto the megaliths
Yeah.
are snakes.
Okay, so there's these huge megaliths. There's lots of carvings. They are
Lots
very
of
advanced,
snakes.
very impressive, and you're saying a lot of them are snakes.
Yes, yes. So snakes are the primary
Uh,
symbol.
So I guess if we're just riffing here, it could be, a lot of people, have speculated that that place could be sort of like a hub where people met to do, whatever, big rituals,
Yeah.
big ceremonies. It was an important place of some kind. I think where you're going with this is that maybe it was an important place where this type of ritual got mass produced and beamed out.
Yeah, yeah. So what's with the snake worship? And then particularly, I really think that Genesis is a cultural memory of Gobekli Tepe.
Hmm.
So there's a few. So first, this is right before agriculture
Yep,
is
12,000 years ago.
developed.
And I'm not a Bible scholar. When do we think the oldest books of the Bible would have been written and composed?
About 3,000 years ago.
Okay.
So it's a Bronze Age text.
Got it. So 12,000 years ago is where we're talking about. This is right before the invention of farming, basically.
Yeah. And so the myth would have to survive 8,000 years.
Yeah.
We have so many examples of myths that have survived 8,000 years. There's extremely strong evidence that we have those sorts of myths.
Just through like oral transmission.
Yes. So, for example, in Tasmania, they describe the geography before the rise of the oceans, and the oceans the geography they're describing was covered up 13,000 years ago.
So there's an example of oral tradition that's accurately describing something that couldn't have been seen by anyone except those living back then.
Yes, and so there's lots of examples about that. It's sexy if you're doing it about people who aren't like the founders of Western civilization. So there's lots of studies that show, hey, this flood myth is true. It's not as sexy to say that about Noah, for example. The story of Noah is a memory of the rise of the floodwaters at the end of the Ice Age.
Yeah. So
right?
You think the Adam and Eve story could be an echo of what may have been happening at Gobekli Tepe?
Yes, and so other evidence about that. So it says that in Eden there are 4 rivers that flow out of it. So there's the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Pishon, and the Gihon. We don't know what those last 2 are, but we do know the Tigris and the Euphrates. And if you look at the headwaters of those 2 rivers, there's Mount Karakadag is in between 2 of them, very far up. And that is by genetic tests, that's where we domesticated the first wheat. And so it's just kind of this. So why is that detail right in the Bible? So it's saying there's Eden, and right after Eden we get agriculture, and we did the genetic studies and we found, yes, at Karakadag, which is at the headwaters of at least 2 of the rivers mentioned, that is exactly where humans first domesticated wheat.
Huh. Yeah, it's just, one of the big themes here with a lot of this stuff is like, it is just peculiar that these things line up if it's all supposed to be arbitrary and made up.
Yes, and so also this isn't some whack theory. So lots of people believe this, even archaeologists. So there's Jacques Calvin. He was a French archaeologist who worked in the Near East for his entire career, for like 30 years. And he wrote this book in early 90s where he argued that there was that the reason we got the agricultural revolution was that there was a preceding spiritual revolution that had to do with our idea of self. So we became more like aware of ourself as an individual. Yeah. And then that produced a society which would then invent agriculture. And he argued in that the stories of so the Greek creation myth as well as the creation myth in Genesis are memories of the transition to agriculture.
What does the Greek creation myth remind us?
So he there was particularly talking about how humans got the arts of civilization, which was from Prometheus. And so he was connecting it to the fall, that we did something wrong to get this power. That it was somehow ill-begot that we became like fully civilized humans.
Yeah. And I guess the basic core idea to that is it's ill begot, like something went wrong. And I guess that's maybe bound up with, well, on the one hand, we've got all these new abilities, which are good, right? We can now do agriculture and invent stuff like we couldn't before. But also, this is presumably exactly the trait that predisposes us to new kinds of mental illness.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why humans, right? Like, no matter how well or how poorly our mouse models of depression tell us about the human experience. Like we all know, like mice don't get depressed in the way that a human can.
Yeah. I mean, there's a song I like about depression. It talks about storyline fever. And it's basically like you can get stuck in this recursive loop, and
these stories.
It's only because we have an I am that we have any of these problems.
Yeah. And now, so everyone intuitively knows that like we can understand subject-object distinctions. I have a concept of myself. It's just all baked into our language. It's all very natural and intuitive to everyone's going to be listening to this. Tie this concept of I to recursion and really unpack for people from more of a computational perspective. What is recursion, and why do you think that's key here?
So recursion is some process that takes itself as input, or it's some process that does a computation, and then the output of that computation is fed back into this process.
So there's a loop. It's a loopy concept. Literally, there's an output that becomes its own input.
And you might be referring to Douglas Hofstadter, I am a strange loop.
Yeah.
So that's this idea that I requires recursion is really popular within philosophy.
I see.
And so Douglas Hofstadter writes about how there's just some weird recursion where it's almost like there's a pointer at a different level than itself, and then it's this kind of mystery that produces consciousness. So that's what he thinks. It's actually pretty similar to Deacon. He talks about how symbolic thought is the result of recursion. That if you have a pointer to some level of abstraction that is not itself, that is required for symbolic thought.
Mm-hmm. But part of what you're saying is, okay, literal snake venom may have been involved at one point. It didn't necessarily need to always be there. There could have, just like any other aspect of culture, these things would have mutated and become elaborated and differentiated in different cultures around the world. But I think the core of this, if I'm understanding your thesis, is that if this is true, there would have been some ritual which would have some way or other, through meditation, through venom, through some combination of different stuff, fasting, what have you. It was putting people into some kind of probably dissociative, altered state, this experience of death and rebirth some way. And in this ritual, this was important for people to develop this recursive ability that gave rise to the sense of I.
Yes. And I think more than just giving them that ability, it, for cultural reasons, became like, oh, you're a real person after you experience this.
Yeah. Well,
and so there's also just a different social...
Yeah. You get you get status. And what's interesting about that is, even to this day, even in our culture, that is what rituals often do. If you think about like a graduation ritual, it's like, you put on the funny hat, you do your high school graduation, and now you're this new kind of person. You can think about, rituals all over the world, in all places. You often go through some arduous journey in some sense. You put on the glove filled with bullet ants or whatever, you complete, you have 4 years of schooling, whatever it may be. But this idea is that after this ritual takes place at the end of that, you're now this new kind of person. And what you're saying is that this ritual, which may be sort of the ultimate ritual, it's not just that you're a new kind of person, it's like now you're a real person or something like that.
Yeah. And I kind of think that if there was some point where humans could learn I am, but didn't naturally, or it wasn't in part of culture in general, I kind of think once you discover I am and a way to teach it, there is no way that it wouldn't just spread over the entire world. Like it's such a powerful idea, and it does seem like we have it and animals don't. And so that's really what I go back to. Like there should have been some moment like this, right?
Yeah. Well, is something that's springing to mind to me here. Is it possible or plausible, if what you're saying is accurate, the way you're laying it out here, at some point, shouldn't there have been like potentially in very recent history, maybe some isolated tribe somewhere in some
Yeah.
deep pocket of the world that didn't have this ability? Like, and if that was the case, like, how would we see it? Would we be able to tell? Like, what do you think about that?
So I like the interpretation. There's a weird line in the Bible, like the sons of God came down to the daughters of man. I kind of like that as a cultural memory
Hmm.
of when men were more schizophrenic than women. So
Mm.
I like that we are getting that from, I don't know, from 10,000 years ago, this kind of myth. Because you can imagine, I mean, we haven't talked about sexual selection, but if women developed I am more, like you can just imagine who they'd want to mate with. Like it would be maybe kind of a drag if somebody is not completely aware,
Yeah.
right? And so you can imagine some
Mm.
sexual selection dynamics.
Hmm. Which would also, to the extent that's true, this would also explain why this type of change could happen on a very fast time course.
Yes.
Yeah, so the strong sexual selective pressure would help take care of that. This, the other thing that's sort of been implicit in some of the things you've said is this starts to make sense of why you see sex differences in things like rates of schizophrenia.
Yeah, yeah. So men are more schizophrenic
Yeah,
than women.
yeah. Wow. Um, what do you think? I don't, let's like. I know that you like this idea because we were talking about your ideas here. What do you think? Like, what are some of the biggest weaknesses or in this general model, and what are some of the strongest alternatives?
The other natural place is to say there was like a very general evolution
Hmm.
over the last 2 million years. And so
Hmm.
that's because it does um our genus seem like you can argue we have a special relationship with tools.
Hmm.
And then there's also Neanderthals were possibly producing symbolic art even back maybe 150,000 years ago.
Hmm.
They are arranging seats in caves in kind of strange ways and deep
Yeah.
into caves. And at the transition, like right when they're going extinct, there's also more like they're actually producing cave art, or that's highly debated, but there could be some there.
Yeah. So I guess the
Um,
more, so I know that this is, there's a lot of debate on this stuff and the archaeological record is by its nature sparse. But I guess over time, if more and more artifacts start showing up earlier and earlier that show
yes.
clear evidence of symbolic cognition, that would become increasingly problematic for what you're saying.
Yeah, so there was the thing recently about the Homo naledi
Yes. And I know that's
burial,
very controversial.
300,000, very controversial. So
Yeah.
yeah, if that were true, so if that would imply that this very divergent part of our genus a long, long time ago were burying their dead, yeah, that would definitely be a mark against the Eve theory of consciousness because
Mhm.
it has to happen so recently for myths to be informative.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
There's also so the genetic bottleneck starts actually like 60, 70,000 years ago.
Yeah. And I'm not fully up to date on this literature, but let's remind people of what that is. Are you referring to this basic? There's a fairly long-standing idea from population genetics and human evolution that as we were coming out of Africa, more or less, we went through some huge population bottleneck, and we can see clear indications for that in the signatures of genetic diversity in living humans.
Yeah, yeah. So everybody who isn't in Africa has a huge there's some bottleneck
Yeah, there's
in
basically we're
our
much less diverse in our genome than you would otherwise think.
yeah. And I mean, so I'm not a geneticist. It seems like that um yeah, so definitely that's being complicated,
Hmm.
that story right
Hmm.
now.
I see.
But it also it's so how much if that there's these different lineages that go back even 300,000 years, to what degree could that have the culture, the snake cult or whatever jumped? How much could that do in this time period? And so that could be highly problematic for the theory.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. What I don't know what I mean. Have you talked to many people about this? Are there any, like, has anyone independently come up with something kind of similar to this that's out there writing about it?
So Tom Frost, that's why I had him on my podcast.
Yeah,
Is
the guy
he
that you
so
mentioned
he
earlier.
yeah he I mean editor-in-chief of adaptive behavior
Yeah,
and had basically the same model. Is that cave art is the start of subject-object separ separation, and
mhm.
then some right spread, and that's why all of our rights are so similar and also so violent, is that they
Yeah,
share some violent ancestor. So there's like I think I try and move people to see like, hey, there's this guy who has a lab, studies this, and he still takes this idea seriously, even though of course everything in this space is highly, highly speculative.
yeah, yeah. How, in principle, how, um, I know there's no one answer to this, and lots of different perspectives here depending on the discipline people, someone comes from. We're talking about culture, we're talking about things that don't fossilize necessarily, even though there are some artifacts we might point to. I know how much evidence do you think could emerge to bolster an idea like this, or I mean, is it just always going to be mostly speculation and not very
I
provable?
think that a lot. So one of the reasons, like I've devoted a lot of time and effort to this,
Yeah.
but I think that it's empirically testable.
Hmm.
And so I think if something like the sand shift about diffusion, people start studying diffusion more, or all of the genetic stuff. It's a whole new world, and so who knows what we're going to have access to in 10 years.
Hmm.
But I'm happy that Substack exists because you can kind of just put out ideas out there.
Hmm.
Um, and that's the first step. I am also interested in more like serious writing, but at this stage, I think the most useful peer review I can get is from people like you who
Hmm.
ask like good questions and put me on the spot.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, wow. And then, so how does language tie into this in your view? Is it very intimately bound up with this, or do you think language or some kind of proto language was pre-existing prior to the emergence of this recursive ability?
So, language as far as communication must have existed for a long time. So
Hmm.
animals have different calls for different types of
Yeah.
predators, for example.
Yeah.
And so we could have, I don't know, 100,000 years ago before recursion, we could have had just an encyclopedic
Yeah.
set of words
Yeah.
that we were learning. Actually,
Probably
Neanderthals,
basically what you're saying is that we could have for a very long time had, say, a large number of vocalizations which pointed to things concretely in the
yeah.
world, but it probably lacked some of the features of what we consider full-fledged human language today.
Yeah, so some sort of grammar. And so
Yeah.
that could have come later. I mean, there's not really any point of me making like of saying how self-awareness is related to
Yeah. Yeah.
language, other than just pointing to the huge literature that exists that tries to connect them to. Like
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say anything Descartes and Hegel didn't find.
Yeah. 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 But wow, like it is, as someone, right? I mean, I never like formally studied mythology or anything, but when you start reading about all these creation myths, which are, they're always fun to read about, and it's sort of interesting from a cultural enrichment standpoint. But when you start noticing, when you do like this comparative thing, and you think about these stories and these memes and these elements
Yeah.
of culture, the way that an evolutionary biologist would study phenotypes, physical traits of animals, and start thinking about it from, a family tree perspective, it is striking that you see all of these otherwise it is very bizarre that all these motifs come up in all of these cultures and myths throughout the entire world. And it's just, it begs, there must be some kind of explanation for that, because if it can't just be coincidence.
Yeah, so there's actually a niche field of where they make phylogenetic trees of myths. So what they do is they'll
Hmm.
take a group of similar myths that they think are about the same thing.
Yeah.
So it could be creation myths, and then or the wild hunt,
Yeah.
and they come up with a set of facts about it. And so there might be 17 facts or 50 facts,
Yeah.
and they just code this as yes, no.
Hmm.
Like the protagonist is a bear could be a question.
Mhm.
And then they get a vector, and then they do clustering on
Yeah.
these different vectors because they'll have dozens of examples of this all over the world. However, I think that field is very bad because whenever they're working with a global myth, they always just from the get-go assume that this is before out of Africa. So that they just a
Mm.
priori make this assumption that there's no way that culture could have spread after, like, if it's universal, then it
Yeah.
has to be before out of Africa. And so basically, they don't want to say that um, anything in Australia is due to recent influence, like in the last 20,000 years.
I
They don't
see.
want to say that.
I see. Is
And
that
so
just
they
because
say everything is
people are sensitive about certain cultural issues?
yes, yes. Um, and so for example, there's a Harvard philologist, was it's something Witzel. He wrote the on the origin of mythology, and so
Mhm.
he makes this case that like there was a first creation myth told, and like 100,000 to 160,000 years ago in Africa, and he specifically to get that date he uses genetics. So he says, because we've been separated for this, but he's like, I don't know, what does he do now? There's evidence that people have been separated for 300,000 years ago. So does he now say, oh, the root must be 300,000 years?
Yeah.
Um,
You're saying sort of the essence of what you're getting at here is for all of these ideas, you either have to suppose something was inherited and therefore goes back that far along to our
yep.
last common ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago in Africa, or your style of model is that no, something arose later, but then diffused culturally to everyone. And so that's the explanation for why it's universally around today rather than being literally inherited from the last common ancestor.
Yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
so one of the, I just think that their model makes no sense. So
Mm-hmm.
why, what evidence is there that myths can last 100,000 years? It's
Yeah.
just, to me, that's just silly, especially with like so similarly. Like, why would it last? Like, it just flies in the face of
Yeah.
all of
They
the
would have diverged more substantially in that length of time, is what you're saying.
yes. And then the second thing is there is so much human history in the last 100,000 years. And these people do not even take a stab of trying to explain why the Holocene transition. Why did around the world, like five different groups of people invented agriculture all at kind of the same time?
Yeah.
And if you think that myths can last 100,000 years, certainly there are going to be myths about the transition to agriculture.
Right.
And then, so okay, so then why don't they interpret Genesis and go back and start looking for a snake cult or some religious idea that involves snakes about 12,000 years ago? Like they just these people that say myths can last 100,000 years, they have no interest in that very, very basic, um, I I guess, application of their belief.
Hmm. So yeah, I want to go back to Gobekli Tepe and stuff. So you mentioned that like half, I don't think it's fully excavated yet. I don't know too much about this stuff, but you said, I think you said around half of the megaliths are snakes.
So half of the animals that are carved into the
Yes.
megaliths are snakes, and that's only true if you count each individual snake. So sometimes there are clusters of
Yeah.
snakes.
But there's a lot, no matter
Yeah,
how
yeah.
you
So
cut it.
snakes are
Yeah.
definitely the dominant creature at
Yeah. Yeah.
Gobekli
Yeah.
Tepe.
And it's like, I guess, you know, other than your idea, it would be like, how would you explain sort of the fixation of people all over the world on snakes? I guess the traditional way to think about that would be like, well, snakes are dangerous and we've always been fearful
Yeah.
of them. And so it's like sort of this evolutionary argument about like being afraid of a deadly animal.
Yes, but in that case, why no evidence of snake worship before 7,000 years ago in
Right.
Australia?
Right.
Like why, or in the Americas before 11,000 years ago?
Yeah.
It's like, just point me to earlier snake worship if you think
Yeah.
it's just some deep-seated thing in us.
Yeah. 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 Um, and I know we already covered up on this, but it was so wild. I just want to know if there's more here. So we were talking about present day use and ingestion of snake venom. You gave the example of it being used, cobras being used today in India. Are there any other examples? Is there anything else like that? I mean, that's astonishing. I mean, I'm taking your word for this. It's not like I disbelieve you, but it is
Yeah,
so
people can look it up.
astonishing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like people are getting high on snake venom.
Yeah.
Wow. Is it just in India today, or is it like more widespread than that?
It's well, as far as people recording it, it's
Yeah,
mostly in India.
I see.
There is so there is a death and rebirth ritual among the Hopi Indians,
Hmm.
and so it involves the bull roar is important to
Yeah.
them, and it involves getting bit by a rattlesnake.
Hmm.
And they drink a like an antivenom before they do this snake
Really?
dance, and it literally involves getting bit by a rattlesnake. And then you look at rock art in the area, dated back thousands of years, and there's literally shamans with like eating snakes.
Really?
Yeah, very, very strange. They
Wow.
also found some coprolite, which is the technical word for poop, dated about 2,000 years ago in Texas. And the person had eaten a rattlesnake whole,
Wow.
like fangs and everything and scales, rattlesnake whole. And so anyway, the archaeologists are like, this has got to be ritual, right? Like, why are they eating the fangs of a rattlesnake?
Yeah.
So anyway, lots of weird stuff all over the world. And so for over 100 years, people have written about the similarities of the Eleusinian mysteries and the Hopi snake dance. So
Hmm.
they said like there are just so many, and when diffusion was popular, it was like, oh, there must be
Hmm.
some phylogenetic
Hmm.
connection.
How do you so if the idea here is this ritual gave people this sense of I, and that that's sort of what we're talking about here. One thing that's a little bit confusing, although maybe I can think of how you were going to answer this, but like when people like Plato talked about doing the Eleusinian mysteries, this was something they did once in their lifetime, but they did it as adults. So
Yep.
clearly Plato didn't need that ritual to have his sense of self. Like how do you square some of those details?
Yeah, I think after a while, if it is so extraordinarily painful, maybe people die sometimes, and you don't need it. Like it seems like it would fall out of fashion.
Mhm.
So you can think of Abraham sacrifices his son Isaac. I mean, there's no snakes involved, but it's an interesting thing where it's human sacrifice, and then it's like actually God will provide a ram. And so could this be some memory of the transition from like human sacrifice to animal sacrifice?
Hmm.
I'm actually not sure what we have evidence for archaeologically first, human or animal
Yeah, yeah.
sacrifice.
Interesting. Hmm. Interesting. So, I mean, we've already covered a lot, and this. I mean, this is interesting stuff, and it's like so diverse and too in terms of the knowledge it draws on. You have to understand creation myths and aspects of linguistics. You got to understand human evolution and paleoanthropology stuff, archaeological record, and obviously you have an interesting background as an electrical engineer and like a data science guy. Um, how do you like? It's a really interdisciplinary area. It's probably really hard to kind of tie all these threads together, which is partly why, like, there's only so many people in the world who are going to learn enough about each of these domains to sort of come up with ideas like this. How much time are you spending sort of just studying these different areas? Is this just
So
sort
I
of like your
was
thing?
absolutely obsessed about it for a while.
Yeah,
Like going up to like Eve Theory of Conscious version 3.
yeah.
And so yeah, there was maybe a year or so where I just thought about it all the time. I'd wake up with ideas, I'd go running, have more ideas. I was always trying to read more and more.
Hmm.
Now it doesn't take up as much time because I've kind of got it out of my system, got it there. I think that I articulated the model well enough that like if it's right, people will come back to it and it'll gain more favor.
Yeah,
And so there's nothing more I really need to do. Although I mean I really enjoy coming on podcasts like this
yeah, yeah.
to
You think the ideas are well fleshed out enough as you've articulated them on your Substack that there's fairly clear confirming and disconfirming evidence that could emerge with time.
yes, yes.
Yeah. And I guess the key piece of disconfirming evidence, or the type of disconfirming evidence, is what we mentioned before. So the more evidence that emerges that symbolic cognition was clearly around much, much earlier, potentially even in diverse species of Homo, the more that emerges, the more problematic it is for what you've articulated.
Yes. Although just the stuff about a snake cult. So let's say the snake cult didn't give you I am.
Yeah.
I think I've come up with pretty compelling evidence that there was some snake, like there was something that spread worldwide. And I think that by itself could be pretty interesting, although it would be disappointing to me first.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that's all it is.
Yeah. So I don't know. Do you want to tell people where can they read your stuff, or what's the best article that summarizes this stuff, that has all of the links and the resources to the research?
Yeah, so just my Substack, vectorsofmind.com. I have pins, Eve Theory of Consciousness version 3. So that's the best place to start. And then I also I did a recent episode of podcast monologue where it's just overview of articles to date. That would be the second place to go.
Okay, great. Anything else you want to say? Anything you want to reiterate or tie together from the conversation?
Maybe to talk a little bit more about 2 million years ago, I think there's some huge holes in that. So there's, let's say all of the species of Homo have symbolic thought.
Okay.
What was it about Homo sapiens that caused us to take over?
Right. So 2 million years ago, the genus Homo is now around, but you've also got these other species of Homo all over the world, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, etc. And so the idea is, if we suppose they all had symbolic cognition, why is it that only Homo sapiens took over and basically ended up replacing all of those other ones?
Yes, exactly. And then also, what about the Holocene transition?
Mm-hmm.
So why was that all why did it all happen at the same time?
Yeah.
And basically the reasoning against evolving symbolic thought in the last 100,000 years is saying, oh, something like that couldn't have evolved in that time period. However, that is what I think is the strongest argument.
Basically
for
saying
that.
it's such a complicated thing, it needed more time than that to bake.
Yes. However, the ancient genetics is, I would say, disproving that, but it's certainly providing evidence against that. So I think that the 2 million position is getting weaker because of that. And so in my mind, probably the pendulum will swing back to earlier or more recent explanations of human origins.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, my take on what you're saying and some of the stuff you articulated is that for a number of decades now, going back to, into the 20th century, the sort of a dominant dogma in thinking about human evolution is that, well, we basically haven't evolved in a substantial way in 50,000 years. And so all of the interesting stuff must have been baked in before that. And basically all of the genetic evidence, population genetic evidence we have, especially from ancient human genomes, has just consistently disagreed with that since then. There's been substantial changes that have taken place in the last few tens of thousands of years, even the last 10,000 years. And there probably was substantial changes in cognition that were selected for, since after Homo sapiens was radiating out of Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I 100% agree. Thanks for having me on. And I think of your listeners who are sympathetic to the stoned ape hypothesis, I think the primordial antigen must have been snake venom. Or did I say the stoned ape theory, right?
Yeah.
It must have been snake venom, if you already believe that.
Yeah. So in some ways, this is a new riff on the stoned ape theory. It's very different in many of its details, but that piece of it is similar, at least. All right. Well, Andrew Cutler, thank you for your time. These are really fun ideas to talk about, and you've certainly tied together lots of cool stuff. I recommend people check out your Substack. You're a good writer, and you tie together a lot of references that people might be interested in: books, articles, studies, all that stuff. So check it out if you think this stuff is interesting.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.